Hello viewers and welcome to another Driver San Francisco video. This one's slightly different. This is an interview with Martin Edmonson, the creative director behind Driver. What was interesting for me was discussing with him his vast career. He was a developer from the mid-80s, my developer heroes, if you like, between the late 80s and early 90s. You know, these were the guys you'd always say, wow, I bet they're amazing at the game, you know, because back then games were largely impossible because there wasn't a great deal of testing. But for me, it was an era that I wanted to get some insight into. You know, it's an era that, you know, really sort of got me into video games and how they've developed since. And this is a two-part interview. It's very insightful. It goes through his career and brings us right up to present day and looking at the latest Driver game. And I hope you're all enjoying the demo. But enough of my rambling. Check this out.
So Martin, thanks for sparing the time today. First, I'd like to find out where Reflections began. Where does your story in the games industry begin?
Well, Reflections started really myself and a school friend actually in 1984, and we basically started writing a game for the 8-bit BBC Micro, because before then my brother and I had got a BBC Micro for Christmas, and so started messing about with you know, little bits of programs and so on. And the first game that we worked on, I worked on a game with a school friend, and that was published by a company called Superior Software back in the day, and it was a very simple game. It was a sideways scrolling or four-way scrolling castle game, and it had things that were quite ingenious in the day, like you found a key and went to a door and it opened the door. Quite original back in 1984.
Was that a text adventure?
It was a four-way scrolling ran in 30 frames a second thing with a castle, and you could play an elf or a you know, an adventurer or a thief or whatever, the usual sort of Dungeons and Dragons.
Quite ambitious thing.
Back in '84 it was, and it was an enormous map as well. Yeah. And you could walk all the way around the outside of this castle, and then you finally got your way into the castle, and it was, you know, little puzzles and things like that, and weapons.
So on from that then, because really before PS1 really and Destruction Derby, I didn't really know much about the journey of Reflections as a company.
Well, the first game was this game called Ravenskull, or Castle Ravenskull, on the BBC Micro, and then we produced another couple of games on the BBC, and then we skipped over that next generation of you know, the consoles, and went to the Commodore Amiga. And that was our first game for the Commodore Amiga. Was actually called Ballistics, and it was like a crossfire kind of steel ball game. And the second game that we did was Shadow of the Beast, which was a very sort of deep parallax scrolling game, 13 layers of parallax scrolling and tons of colours. It was kind of, that's the thing we were selling it based on. It was a very fantasy art based, like based on the sort of art of Roger Dean and Rodney Matthews and those kind of guys at the time, and an adventure. But predominantly what we were trying to do there was, I was always fascinated by arcade games and arcade hardware. Games like Defender, Williams Defender, and older ones as well, like Robotron and Asteroids, and things I used to play when I was really young, you know, at the ice rink and all that sort of thing when I was tiny. And those games all ran in 60 frames a second and had multicoloured sprites and all these things that were very difficult to do on a computer. So the point of Shadow of the Beast was to try and do something that looked like an arcade game. And then after that we did a game called Awesome, which was a space game, which did the first sort of scaling sprite type thing like the arcade game Space Harrier, but to actually run it in a high frame rate and to make it look like a fluid motion. We had this enormous snake that you had to battle in space, and you know, all sorts of different modes.
So you've always been pushing some technical boundaries. I mean, I have to say, for me, Shadow of the Beast was the epitome of Psygnosis. I mean, because their whole design and their look was almost built around Shadow of the Beast. There was a sequel as well, wasn't there? Was you involved in that?
Sequel to Shadow of the Beast. There was Shadow of the Beast 2 and Shadow of the Beast 3, yes, and they were different games. We had the first one was really just sort of like a technical demonstration of what the Amiga could do and how pretty it could look. The game was very simple. And then the second one, we wanted to make the game more advanced, and we put all sorts of quite complex puzzles in there where you had to, to rescue someone from a prison, and they would then help you to do something. And then the third one was even more complicated in terms of its, puzzles with physics puzzles and all sorts of things. So the game, changed quite significantly over the years. But the tech had to change as well, because we were always pushing it in some way, and the Amiga was an incredibly flexible piece of hardware, probably one of the most flexible ever. Certainly of that generation anyway, and it allowed you to do all sorts of different things and different types of play fields, different colours, different layers of scrolling, but each one was traded off against something.
So after those then, I mean, where are we up to now, like 1991? What was Reflections doing between 91 and say 95? Or was that all preparing for upcoming technologies?
Well, our first PlayStation 1 game was Destruction Derby, which we did again with Psygnosis published that for us. I do remember. Yeah, we did a game called Brian the Lion, which was a very small game in terms of sales, because unfortunately we were doing like a bundling deal with Commodore, and it was going to be bundled with the machine, because again it was like a technical thing. We had full screen rotation of the whole screen, and expansion contraction of enormous play fields, all running in 60 frames a second on the Commodore Amiga. And when we showed it to Commodore, they were like, "Ooh, wow! We want this to show off." It was like a bit of a two-fingered salute to Nintendo and their Super NES with all of its rotation stuff. So we produced that game, and unfortunately Commodore got into all sorts of financial difficulties in the game. The game came out, but it just didn't sell that well. And then after that, I set up completely on my own and set up the company as a sort of a company with bringing in more staff, and we started working on Destruction Derby 1, which came out more or less at the launch of PlayStation 1.
Now I have to say that's one of the most exciting times for me. 95, autumn 95, you had Wipeout, Destruction Derby, both games that were mind-blowing in graphics. I mean, you could the cars as well in Destruction Derby were huge. It was very sort of big, sort of in scale, because a lot of the games, I don't know, they just seem to be a bit more shrunken down, but it was great to see what went into developing that at the time. Was it a huge team?
Well, it felt huge at the time because I'd been used to just myself and one other person. So Destruction Derby was around about 7 people. Destruction Derby 1, DD2 I think was more like 13 or 14. And some of the guys that worked on those games are still here today, by the way. So it's got a lot of history to it, this studio. But it was developed relatively quickly, because the PlayStation 1 was a pretty easy machine to work on. I was absolutely fascinated with stock car racing and banger racing from being a kid. In fact, my dad used to take me and my brother to watch stock car racing, banger racing, destruction derbies, or demolition derbies as they called them back then, around the UK. And I was so fascinated when the race, use the word race in the loosest possible sense, but when this sort of carnage had finished, I'd jump over the fence and go running across and just take photographs or just inspect all this sort of twisted metal. And so I had a bit of a childhood passion for that, and it was very apparent that you could do for the first time something like that on PlayStation 1. So in fact all the damage textures and the realistic modelling of the damage, not the modelling but the texture, of the damage, all came from tons of photographs that I've taken from the UK banger racing scene.
I remember doing the bowl event where you just all crash into each other, but I was one of those people who used to reverse, damage the back of the car and save the front for the very end when there's only a couple going around.
Well, that was the tactic, and that is the tactic in real destruction derbies as well, because of course the engine and usually the radiator, or they tend to move the radiator, but the engine and all the the delicate gubbins is at the front of the car, so you do get a lot of reversing. So, and we monitored damage on the rear, the front, the sides, the wings we even monitored, and the car would start to handle differently and get twisted and so on. So for its time it was very advanced damage modelling.
So was the next game for you guys then Destruction Derby 2?
Yes, it was. Actually, I wanted to do Driver straight after Destruction Derby because you know, it was an idea from the movies, from having seen lots of car chase movies. I wanted to do it early, but Psygnosis wanted a sequel, and Destruction Derby 1 sold so well that it made, you know, would have been crazy not to sequel it. So we did Destruction Derby 2 next, and we did it on quite a tight schedule as well. I think it was around a year, well, certainly from release to release it was around a year, and we answered a lot of the things that people wanted to see. They wanted bigger tracks, and they wanted you know, more speed, and so we did that, and that did well, and then we got stuck into Driver.
Go! Wow! What a race! What a track!
So a great interview there so far. That's just part one. Part two, we go much more up to present day, of course, and up to Driver San Francisco. But it was really insightful seeing those early years, you know, developing for the BBC. You know, Shadow of the Beast was a simply mind-blowing game, and I can't tell you just how amazing it was when we first saw that demoing back in the early 90s. It was absolutely staggering graphics. Again, when you look at Destruction Derby, you know, that game was, along with Wipeout, mind-blowing when the PlayStation 1 came out in Europe. That was first shown. Fantastic. I mean, the graphics were crazy good. We'd never seen anything like it, and that car crashing, smashing and bashing is what's inspired much of what you see in Driver today. So that's part one, looking at the early career. Part two is the second half and moving up to Driver, so check that out as well, and I'll see you all soon.